Well, good morning. So I've been asked to kind of start this off just setting a little bit of a framework, a background, no pun intended on the framework. Why are we here? Why is this something of interest? Why do we have an economist here to speak to us? Which is, Gian Luigi is an economist. Years ago, we did, when I was very early on with the Division of Procurement Services in South Carolina, we had a contract come along, and it was a task order contract. It wasn't, which is one variation of an indefinite delivery contract, or which is called a framework agreement in the European setting, which I actually prefer as a name. It's more indicative. And I was very unhappy with it, right? I think, less than 5 years. And I felt like it circumvented all these different policies and procedures and rules that I had just spent the last few years learning and advocating for in bid protests. And so I went to the client and said, I brought my concerns up, and I was told, well, you got 2 days to fix it. So I worked up the first set of rules for secondary competition. I was really dissatisfied with it, but I had inserted myself. Nobody had really asked me to get involved. So I had, as my, surprise, the people in the audience who know me. But that was kind of the last time. Well, they've reused that multiple times, but they've only used it for task orders, and no real change has ever been made to the IDIQ approach for what you might call commercial items, particularly supplies. And the years rolled by, and I just kind of kept my mouth shut and did what I was told to do. And then I watched as the state's approach to indefinite delivery for IT professional services was just horrible. And it was awful. The misuse of the contract was off the charts. We had one example where we spent a sum of money I just won't even say publicly through one task order, which was never intended. And we found ourselves putting a procurement officer at the entry level in charge of monitoring it, when there's enormous pressure to use these things in ways that individual wasn't really in a position to handle or manage or say no. And so the client finally came to me and said, help, we need you to fix it, and we don't have much time to do it. And I thought, this is my chance. And I said, well, okay, you got it. And I started reading and started doing research, and it was some very long weeks for several months. And one of the things I read was a whole series of articles from 2008, because there's an entire public contract law journal devoted to IDIQs. And I went down the rabbit hole only to find that there has been an enormous amount of discussion at the federal level about all the problems, pros, cons, challenges in IDIQs, and everything from commodities to professional services and the whole gambit. And what I was learning was there are lots of problems, and we are certainly not unique to it. There were just audit reports and advisory groups that were trying to identify what were best practices and what needed to be done right, but I wasn't finding a solution. And then Chris connected me, or told me about a book that was written by this Italian guy, and I thought, really? Okay, and he's an economist, he's not a lawyer. Now, his co-author is a lawyer in the European setting, and Caroline, is it Wilson? Nicholas, thank you. Caroline Nicholas. And I opened the book and I read the first chapter, and I thought, this is it. This guy's laid it all out. So I did some research on him and found a YouTube video where he had spoken at a European event, and I couldn't turn it off. It was just a magical presentation. It was so easy to follow. He laid it all out. So I read the whole book, and it's not a thin book, and it's tabbed and highlighted and cross-referenced. And I got to the end of it, and by the time I'd gotten to the end of it, I had written a complete set of rules for our specific need, which was, how do we do this right? How do we do it really fast? How do we accommodate all the underlying policies and procedures, but not the law necessarily, that underlie procurement, make it really fast and efficient and constrained? And we are about to put it out, to set sail and put the solicitation out once we negotiate with one final internal customer. And this presentation kind of grew out of that, because I felt like the message of indefinite delivery contracts and the problems and the solutions, right? The pros and cons needed to be heard. And so I wanted it to really get some attention. So Chris here has written, I think, multiple law review articles about it and spoken about it. Obviously, Gian Luigi wrote the book about it. And before I got up here, a week or two ago, I called the people at the senior manager and the procurement services division, and I said, you know, we've done this in a way that y'all know I don't agree with for all these years. So why did you finally come to me and say, make it work, McCook, do your thing, right, and get it done quick? And they said, well, the way we're working it, we're not getting speed to market. We're getting bogged down, but we're not getting speed to market. There's no accountability in the way we've been doing it. There's no transparency in the way we're doing it. It's being abused, and we don't know how to fix it. We don't know how to get to standard terms with all the vendors because what we're having is differing terms on just every task order. There's no control over it. And we have no price competition for the actual work on each individual order. And of course, IT professional services, you cannot rely on unit pricing like you can on asphalt, right? I can get a unit price on asphalt and by the mile, or pencils. But when you're doing hourly rates where they can just make up the number of hours, my state doesn't have the framework, certainly in the law, or the people to actually manage that type of contract. And it's the way it was being administered was not fair and equitable to all the vendors. It was kind of a hunting license. And I thought, well, let's share the news. So this morning's presentation is really to introduce the topic, give you an opportunity to hear from two world-class experts, give you some insight into the issues, make you think about it, and then decide what you want to do. Chris, any opening thoughts before we turn it over to Gian Luigi?
Just really delighted that Gian Luigi could join us. Gian Luigi is Cambridge trained, London School of Economics trained economist. He is as he'll be describing to you, he's a senior manager at Concept, which is the Italian centralized purchasing agency, CONSIB, Concept in Rome. It's inside their Department of the Treasury, and it serves serves governments across Italy. So he has accumulated an enormous amount of information, of experience in the use of IDIQ contracts, what they call framework agreements. His co-author, Caroline Nicholas, who wrote the book that Keith was referring to, Caroline was the woman who really pushed through the UN Model Procurement Law. And the UN Model Procurement Law, I was part of the US delegation for that. The UN Model Procurement Law really helped set up international thinking about the use of IDIQ contracts, for the use of framework agreements. So it was in their book, published by Cambridge University Press, is a wonderful introduction to a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about today. I actually saw, on a personal note, I last saw Gian Luigi in Rome in September. My wife and I were doing a Catholic pilgrimage the last 100 kilometers from Viterbo down to Rome. I fell down on the way. So I learned you can actually do a pilgrimage by taxi, and it's not so bad.
There was a sabotage, organized by the
So should we turn it over? Should we turn it over to Gian Luigi?
Yes, yes.
Gian Luigi, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I was adding a comment. It was just the Italian sabotage to keep you in Italy. Actually, Well, I want to thank you all for this extremely, the immense honor of being part of this meeting. Let me just send you my best wishes for the 3rd anniversary of the Law Institute. Pay also my respect to tomorrow, Veterans Day, which I know means a lot to you all. We have something similar in Italy. Obviously, in Italy, things are kind of much lower, a smaller scale, but still, I think this is an important moment for all of us, especially nowadays. So this is a talk, and I have to say, after hearing Keith's introduction, which is one of the most intimidating I've ever heard, so it would be, the best option would be just to leave right now, because I'm putting too much at risk. But I really eager to share with you some thoughts. It would be extremely pretentious to sort of summarize what I've been gathering, studying all over these years. And I have to say this book is that Keith was mentioning is really about the practice, the nuts and bolts, the hands in the business every day here in Italy. I mean, the organization for which I work handles every year something around 9 billion euro of framework agreements, which makes actually Concept one of the biggest in Europe in that respect. But there is a lot coming from international experience, and I have to tell you what triggered, and I want to tell you this, what triggered that book. I was involved with Caroline in one of these international sessions, and we were in Panama, and after 4 hours, there was a long queue of speakers coming from very different environments, Central and South American countries. And they were pretending they were talking about completely different stuff. They were talking about their own experiences and their own problems. And they didn't realize, Caroline and myself realized that they couldn't realize that they were actually talking about exactly the same problems, exactly the same procurement vehicles, but they were, believe it or not, they were misled by the fact that we're using different names. So the fact that we're using IDIQ rather than, multiple award schedule, rather than framework agreements or price registration system, for them meant that we're talking about different things. Now, one of the few advantages that normally an economist has over legal scholars or lawyers is that we don't pay that much attention to some wording. So we tend to go to sort of I would say, the most basic incentive schemes, the structure. And so in a way, it turned out that there are so many practices around the world that they're very close to each other. And the only misleading thing is that we use different names, okay? So what I'm gonna do today with you and jointly with Chris and Keith is to sort of share the way an economist looks at these objects and why these objects actually are so attractive from an economic standpoint. There is so much economics in that, and it's still, extremely surprising. There are very few economists involved in this, and the only reason I can come up with is they don't spend enough. There is a barrier which is provided by the dirt of the practice. Practice is full of a lot of details, and you have to spend time in understanding. And so this is why lawyers have a big competitive advantage over economists, because they're used to kind of, to enter the jungle of contractual clauses and be also at ease with that. Economists, they normally have to fly very high, and so they are scared off by these subtleties. And because I do that every day, so that gave me, at some point, advantage. I could merge sort of the practice and a little bit of economic thinking to put everything together. And Caroline Nichols is an amazing co-author, because she's a lawyer, but actually she's more an economist than she believes she is. That's the point. And so we could immediately converge towards a common jargon, a common language, and that's it. Obviously, this book was written a few years ago. There are new things on the table right now around the world, and I don't have the potential to put them on the table today. So I want to focus on, I would say, on some conceptual pillars that I think are paramount in understanding not only to how to handle, but also how to prevent a quite wide set of potential risks arising from framework agreements. So there is no free lunch in the economy. Every single time we see a potential advantage, we have to be extremely careful, because there might be risks just around the corner. We have to anticipate that. And this is why I think a little bit of strategic thinking coming from my upbringing as a game theorist or applied game theorist turned out to be useful. So this is what I'm going to do. It's basically, the first slide is about the the crucial points of my discussion, I want to spend quite some time in emphasizing the importance of setting the right form of competition and the right times for competition framework agreements, because I think that they are a potentially very useful procurement vehicle to deliver good value for money if we can exploit that dimension. Well, at the same time, we don't have to underestimate, as I said, the risk of that. So I'm gonna lay down some of the potential circumstances which may make the entire picture a little bit bleak or dark. Let me mention one historical fact, which is the following. In Europe, the continental regulation, the provision in our continental regulation about framework agreements was the outcome of a very long discussion and study of, I would say, not completely good practices in the UK and in Ireland, especially in 1990s. I mean, very few people know that, in fact, framework agreements had been in use for centuries in UK. The British Navy used framework agreement, I would say, started as early as the 18th or even 17th century for having ready-to-use contracts for maintaining warships. And this is one of the very, I would say, interesting things about framework agreement, that the legal output is really something coming from a progressive, work on the practice. So it's something practice basically told policymakers things that were not supposed to happen. And so they sort of put their hands on this, and we have now a very, I would say, very short provision, the framework agreement. And this is a very interesting feature of framework agreement, because every single time your provision is very small, it's very short, so the lower the number of words in a provision, the better the life of an economy, because there are in principle a very large number of degrees of freedom. And so you can start thinking about pros and cons in a cost and benefit analysis, which is actually the sea where I like to swim, personally, okay? So can I have the next slide, please? So which is, by the way, Chris' slide. I'm going to interfere a lot with your slides, Chris.
Good. What we want to talk about is why framework agreements are an important legal topic. As Gian Luigi is alluding to, in the modern sense, framework agreements or IDIQ contracts emerged in parallel in the European Union and in the United States in the 1990s, with almost no discussion between the Europeans and the Americans in developing these new areas of law. The American federal experience was very similar to the one that Keith described, where you had a few contracting officials pushing forward with the use of IDIQs, creating a lot of unease in the regulatory structure. What are these people doing? And the regulatory structure slowly rotated and began to accommodate IDIQs in the 1990s and early 2000s. This lack of communication on the two sides of the Atlantic is kind of interesting, because it raises questions. As we integrate a global economy, should there be more communication across different jurisdictions to make sure the laws are aligned so that there aren't artificial barriers to entry? Or do we just resign ourselves to the fact that different countries, different regional governments like the European Union are going to end up in roughly the same place because we all have the same functions, we all have the same pathologies? Gian Luigi's discussions we're going to be going through that these are economic forces driving the pathologies, and therefore these economic forces are driving the regulatory structure, suggests that we can kind of lean back and let the different systems grow in parallel. And that's true here. Keith and I work extensively in the Model Procurement Code here in the United States. It's used by state and local governments. We can kind of let laws evolve in parallel because they end up in the same place. The important thing is to share lessons as we go because by sharing lessons, we begin to see both pathologies and other systems, but we also see opportunities. We're going to be discussing this morning a lot of instances where Europe may do something that we don't do, or we do something that the Europeans don't do. So we exchange ideas about how to make the system better. So that's from a lawyer's perspective. The comparative analysis becomes one of analyzing best practices to make the system better. It's a very interesting place where there were serious discussions in the literature at about 2000 about setting up a rigid international code that everybody would have to follow the same rules. Turns out that that's unnecessary, that the laws, this is just a case study, the laws develop in parallel because we have common pathologies, and then the important thing is that we talk like we're doing today. Keith?
I think the only thing I would add is that I feel like the value I bring to it is not the expertise of an economist, but it's also not strictly what I think my client or our clients often think is our role, which is what's the law. But lawyers are trained to understand the policy behind the law, because in my mind, what is the law? The law is an expression, whether it's in the court opinions or in the statutes, it is an expression of policy. It is in some way intended to say, this is how we're going to define what the policy limits are. And lawyers are supposed to be able to articulate the reasons behind that policy. And when you understand the policy, you can work the rules more efficiently without breaking them. We're also good at drafting procedures and contract documents and regulations. And we can help the clients when they not only identify the ideas, but also help them draft the structure and the rules to make task orders work. So I think that's why for us it's an important legal topic, even if it's not addressed in your code at this point in time.
One of the most frustrating experiences if you live in Europe, especially in Southern Europe, is when you talk to lawyers, even the smarter ones, the approach that they have is normally in terms of what you can do, what you cannot do. It is as if the white and the black boxes were joined in advance. And in fact, when you talk to lawyers working in the sort of more Anglo-Saxon traditions, things are turned to some extent almost upside down, because the economists would say, this is what I'd like to do. This is what is, in principle, the most efficient outcome I'm aiming at. Please show me the way to get there, okay? So I have to say that when I started working here in Rome, I had spent a few years in London, and so I was used to that approach. So when I moved into Italy, it was a shock in terms of this is the perimeter, and this is like, you feel like a horse, and you can move from right to left only 30 meters, and you're right. And I would say, no, that's not the point. The point is we have in our hands one of the most flexible tools in our procurement regulation. I'm talking about, I'm referring to the continental system. I want to exploit all the, corners of the universe. I want to push this to the limits. And I can tell you that if I look backwards and I if I try to recall what you used to do 15 years ago, what we're doing right now, there is half of the galaxy, half of the Milky Way in between in terms of new solutions. And this is really what I think is the kind of negotiation approach between an economist and a lawyer. And I think this is the enriching part of having different know-how involved in this business. And still, after so many years, I still find it very thrilling, not to mention the international dimension of that. Now, this slide that you have in front of you is exactly the slide that sort of motivated that book. We gathered these webinars during the COVID, but even before that, in-person seminars, and we were hearing about all these labels, IDIQ, mass program, framework agreement, price registration systems. I want to mention this because this is used in Brazil. And when, a few years ago, I sort of made a comment to my Brazilian friends, do you know that you're basically using a form of piggybacking? They didn't even know what piggybacking was. So if you just your stock to definition, you don't know you're doing exactly the same thing. The price registration system, which is extremely It's very widespread at the federal level in Brazil. It's nothing more than that. And so they don't know, and some of them don't know because they just are kind of constrained by definition. So let me sort of get to the core. At the core, so the genetic code, next slide please, of this object or this set of objects, it's something which could be summarized, if I can get the, I'm frozen, I'm sorry. Oh gosh.
We're on the stable chemical composition slide.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, but I cannot see the slide. Okay, doesn't matter if you
Stable,
them,
stable chemical composition.
I was going to describe the basic ingredients of the framework agreement. So this is slide number 7. Okay. Okay. So this is slide number framework. What I've defined the universally stable chemical structure.
That's the slide we're on, Gian, Luigi.
This is the one that I'm referring to. Okay. For some reasons I can hear you, but I'm stuck with the slide number 7, and I need the following one. Okay. It doesn't matter if you have it.
You've seen Apollo 13. Americans are very good in a crisis. We're on that slide.
So I'm talking about this idea of a two-stage procedure, where basically at the first stage, some of the terms of condition governing public contracts, future contracts, are determined, written, fixed, you name it. And this first part, which is I would say the most important, but because it set the rules of the game with the market, is normally called framework agreement in Europe or master contract. There might be other definition in the US, but this is the idea. It's a sort of the basic set of conditions governing all the contract that will be awarded downstream after the agreement is concluded. And that's the first stage. The second stage that we call in Europe the call-off stage, which comes from a very UK-based approach to the problem, or we call that stage where specific contract, task order contract, call-off contract, you name it. I have also put the French definition for that, are awarded. So this is a two-stage approach. Why is it the case? And this is justified on a very simple observation. The observation is that procurement is a repeated activity. We buy similar, although not necessarily identical things over time. Things in a civil works, object, goods, services. And in many circumstances, it does not make sense to repeat completely the procedure from scratch every single time we need something. So we can bundle needs under the same umbrella, which is to serve our framework agreement or master contract. And then we can set some or even all of conditions, or most of the conditions, and then when a need arises, we can speed up the process by either issuing a purchasing order or by defining, amending, completing some of those conditions, right? So this is basically the idea, and this idea has been used and exploited by individual procuring entities for bundling needs arising at different points in time and even different places. But in Europe, we've been exploring over the past 20, 25 years, I would say more 20 years, this idea of using framework agreements for bundling needs stemming from different public bodies, from different organizations. And normally, those framework agreements are handled by centralized procurement organization. For instance, if I may give you an example, coming from Italy, we have one centralized procurement organization at the national level, but we also have similar twin sisters or brothers, whatever, at the regional levels. Why? Because they are more specialized in healthcare procurement. So what they do, they bundle these demands coming from municipalities, provinces or small villages or other public bodies, and they put them under the same umbrella. So when you, even by mentioning this, that this immediately generates at least 25 different questions. So how are you going to determine how many clauses you're going to put in the framework agreement? So the first stage rather than the second stage. And if you interact with the market, you're going to select what? You're going to select all of the guys, all the vendors, some of them, one. What are the driving forces determining what is the particular solution you're going to select? So there are many problems, and so each problem will be solved by looking at some dimension. I'm going to look at some economic dimensions with you, needless to say. Let me mention that the framework agreement is, to me, my personal view of framework agreement is one of the, I would say, straightforward translation or the transposition of the lean production mode into public procurement. So when you set a framework agreement, you don't buy anything at all. I mean, in the framework, there are only contractual clauses. Some of them are fixed, some others are not. And so you rely on a smooth supply chain afterwards to make the actual purchases, right? This is why, there was a lot of discussion especially during the first, I would say, 1.5 years of the COVID-19 pandemic about the effectiveness of framework agreements during the pandemic for emergency circumstances. Now, framework agreements work just fine if supply chain works fine. But if there is a global disruption in supply chain, there is no framework agreement which is going to solve any of your problem, right? Because a framework agreement hinges on the fact that there is a small supply chain. So, for instance, we awarded almost immediately 3 framework agreements for ventilators and for PPEs, but they were completely void and empty framework agreements for 2 months because barriers were frozen. There was I would say complete breakdown of international trade, and so there is absolutely nothing that a framework agreement can do. So let's not forget about the fact that a framework agreement, extremely sophisticated technique, can be extremely sophisticated, provided that the environment, and especially nowadays, the global environment works just fine, okay? Now, I'm moving to the next slide.
Actually, Gianluigi, can I throw some things in here from? Can I throw some things in here from the American experience? So to put the legal issues into context, just actually go back to that one. That'd be great, just for a sec, because I want to highlight some of the points that Gianluigi was making. So in the 1990s, late 1990s, early 2000s, position taken by many senior lawyers in the federal government was the contract is the initial master agreement, and the task order is not a contract. The delivery order that comes afterwards on the second stage is not a contract. The exchange of information with the Europeans, one of the benefits was to make nonsense of that, because the Europeans call them framework agreements and then call them, the second stage they call framework contracts. So the use of the word contract is completely arbitrary. And really the policy and legal discussion has evolved over the last 20 years. So nobody in Washington takes a serious position now that a $1 billion task order isn't really a contract, where you have to treat it seriously as a contract. On Gianluigi's point with regards to dealing with emergency situation, we're in New Orleans, okay? New Orleans in 2005, if you walked around, you can see what the defenses that New Orleans has set up against the next hurricane. What you can't see is the IDIQ contracts. After 2005, there was a discussion at the federal level of what went wrong with FEMA. Tom Davis, who was a congressman from Northern Virginia at that point, and a lot of experience in procurement, Tom Davis led a report, and the report said one thing: IDIQs. When you're dealing with a supply chain breakdown in the case of an emergency, you have to have IDIQs in place, and FEMA has really pivoted to using IDIQs more. So as Gianluigi suggested, IDIQs can be a very important way of addressing a broader supply chain in a time of crisis. It's an important starting point for understanding IDIQs. That takes us to the next stage, and something that's going to be a recurring theme here as we walk through the American experience, Amazon.gov, which is not a real word, we made it up, but Amazon.gov captures this entire problem. GSA has opened the door to the use of Amazon and two other sources, Overstock and Thomson Scientific, I think, Fisher Scientific. So 3 different platforms that you can use as a federal user making micro purchases up to $10,000. GAO recently published a report. Amazon now controls, surprise, surprise, 95% of that market. 95% of the orders, the micro purchases, are going through Amazon, not the other two. The other two platforms are just sort of window dressing. Amazon, if you think about it, is really an IDIQ. It's a privately run IDIQ where there are thousands of framework agreements already in place. So when we're talking about legal structures, we always have to be aware that the government, in just one stroke, could open their door to a privately run IDIQ with thousands of vendors. NASPO Value Point is an intermediate step between Amazon.gov and the traditional government IDIQ. We have to understand, if we look at NASPO Value Point from that perspective, we see the pluses and minuses of having really a government-centered structure like NASPO Value Point, as opposed to Amazon.gov, where the government is basically outsourcing procurement to an outside party. The last thing is about, we're going to be talking about pathologies of centralized purchasing agencies. Gian Luigi alluded to local purchasing agencies in Italy. He's in Rome, he's a centralized, they're the 800-pound gorilla in the Italian procurement world, but you have regional centers. And I had a chance to meet with one of the heads, who happens to be a lawyer and he happens to be a professor. He was the head of the Piedmont Regional Purchasing Agency, and he is somebody who is working in our network. So I sat down with him. I said, Professor, you're the head of the regional purchasing agency buying medical supplies. As Gian Luigi alluded to, that's important. But I actually experienced the Italian public health system when I got hurt. So I've had a first-hand experience.
Please, don't make any comment.
I will not mention the rust on the X-ray machine. I didn't tell you, Gian Luigi, that when they started, it keeps making whirring noise, and the lady leaves the room, and it keeps. And I thought, oh my God, am I being bathed in radiation? Anyway, but I asked him. I said, Professor, I said, so who's your customer as a centralized purchasing agency? Who's your customer? And he said, oh, it's the local hospital director. And I said, no, that's not the right answer. And he said, oh, it's the surgeon who's going to be using the scalpel. I said, no, that's not the right answer either. I said, it's the patient. He was shocked at that idea that the patient would be the ultimate customer. So a big part of talking about these issues is talking about the pathologies that are inherent in the most important actors in this overall structure, which is the centralized purchasing agencies, like Gian Luigi's. So we're going to keep returning to that theme over and over again. How do we set up a legal structure that takes into account the pathologies of the centralized purchasing agencies? What I did with the professor, he said, the patient, really? I said, when my wife was in labor with our first child, the OBGYN went down the hall and he decided to watch football. And I said, no, not a good idea. I went down, I tracked him down, I said, let's try to remember who's the customer here. It's my wife, get down there, okay? Always have to remember who the customer is. And that's an important part of our job as lawyers, to set up legal structures to refocus the process on who the real customer is. Gian Luigi, we're going to advance to the next slide for you.
I'm going to use towards the end of this conversation some of these examples about there's a thin, I would say, border between the wise use of discretion and abuse of framework agreements. I'm going to mention this because the first time that a consultant from Western Australia explained to me how the panel contract, which is the local version of framework agreement, worked. I thought, this in Italy would be considered completely unlawful, would be, a well of corruption and lack of integrity. So we don't have to forget that there is also a cultural features that enter the way we design things. I mean, we don't have to forget them, and it would be completely insane not to think that there are solutions that might be considered, efficient or acceptable just because we're in a particular environment. So what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to set the sort of I would say, a neutral picture that would be kind of acceptable almost anywhere. But there are, in fact, extreme forms or extreme solutions that might be conceivable in one environment, not in others. So I'm going to mention this towards the end. The one thing I've already mentioned implicitly some potential advantages of framework agreements is higher administrative efficiency. Let me mention something which relates more closely to a competition aspect, which is the idea that by bundling needs under the same umbrella, there is almost immediately an impact, a positive impact on the buyer's bargaining power. I mean, in the US, I guess you would use more strategic approach to purchasing. And the idea is very simple. To go back to this example, when you are in the healthcare system, in Italy, most of healthcare is in the hands of the public sector. So we have something around 100, 110 public hospitals. And, when it comes to medical equipment, even and especially the most sophisticated part of medical equipment, and you have 100% of buyers facing 3 international bidders, 4 at most. Now, strategic sourcing or bargaining power is one important dimension, right? So the idea of getting those guys together in a way through a centralized procurement agency or organization, this example that actually Chris was making is a first step to raise, not to, I would say, to leaven the playing between the supply side and demand side, but at least to make the imbalance, less unbalanced, so to speak, right? So please keep those figures in mind, because at foreign economies, it's the short side of the market that basically dictates the rules of the game. Although we set the rules of the game in a competitive tendering, actually, if you have 3 guys, and on the other side there are 100 buyers, and I can tell you that the bargaining power, 95% is in the hands of the 3 vendors, which, especially in the healthcare, happen to be, global firms. Okay, so this is one important aspect. Second aspect, which is also related to some extent, is the fact that all those individual needs, in itself, each single need might be a low-value contract, but if you put them together, then all of a sudden you realize, by making just the sum of that the overall value of a master contract is what we say above the threshold, becomes sizable. And then this is a way, this is a very, I would say, very much European way of saying that you make low-value contracts more visible. When I say more visible, because in Europe, I promise I don't want to make any reference to legal aspects, but we do have 2 fairly different regulatory systems above or below certain values. So let me, a very simple example, when your estimated value is below, for goods or services, is below $140,000 or euros, that more or less the same, then the set of rules are kind of much, I would say, looser, and there is much more flexibility. But when the estimated value is above that number, then there are more constraining rules. So by bundling low-value contracts, we may end up above that threshold, which would justify the use of more competitive procedures. And this is very important, because if you want to push for more competition in public procurement markets, bundling small contracts together is one way of doing that. Finally, the idea of having a first stage and second stage, let me go back. This is really my obsession. My obsession is about finding the right balance between standardizing conditions, so finding the common features across different needs that are likely or more appropriately put in the same basket, which is the master contract, from all other conditions that make individual purchases different from each other. So this idea of splitting condition into different sets is a way of determining to what extent contracts are going to be similar. So the extent to which there is standardization in final purchases rather than contract tailoring, right? And willy-nilly, although buyers tend to be, in many cases, strategic. I mean, let me tell you this. When I was a part of the advisory group, the European Commission, when Croatia was on the point of becoming a member of the European Union, and I mean, they had to set up a national centralized procurement, so our twin sister in Croatia. And I remember I was invited at that time. I used to travel much more than nowadays. I was invited to Croatia, and there was a prime minister, an extremely smart lady, making only one comment. She made a comment that to me summarized one of the most important aspects of public procurement. She said, when I hear that going around different ministries, different agencies, I have civil servants saying that they need, strawberry flavored mineral water rather than lemon flavored or that they need 25 variants of mineral water. She said, I cannot believe that these are actually true needs. I mean, to me, essentially what we need is sparkling and still water, and that's it. If you really need a lemon flavored mineral water, you're going to buy out of your pocket. And this is, in a way, it is very provocative, Sandra, right? It's a little bit, I would say, kind of coming probably from a country that I had many years of sort of communist approach also to public procurement. This might sound a little bit too rigid, but in fact, we do know there is a phenomenon going on in public procurement, which goes under the name of maverick buying, which is also always this idea of pretending that one particular need is different from all others so that you can escape and you can go outside of a standing framework agreement because you prefer to run your own procedure. So this is very important. I'm not going to enter this discussion. This is going to take us, but it's very important that we keep in mind that buyers not necessarily are truthfully reveal their preferences in terms of conditions. Sometimes they're strategic because, pretending to be different from each other may have some benefits. And I do know, and I can anticipate that your US ears, this may sound a little bit too aggressive, but I can tell you that even in Northern Europe, this is an argument. If you go to Finland, which is considered one of the best places in terms of the way they abide by the law, et cetera, they use maverick buying. They reckon the maverick buying is one of potential problems in framework agreement. Now, next slide,
Gianluigi, can I just throw in here from the, so I take a completely different approach than Gianluigi to this issue of diversity. Because remember, Gianluigi, he works in the centralized purchasing agency. What does the centralized purchasing agency want to do? Reduce transaction costs by reducing choice, okay? So I was teaching a bunch, and I was in Chisinau long before the war, and I was in Chisinau, Moldova, and there were Moldovan and Ukrainian procurement officials, and they're smart young people. They're focused on the European Union. They're smart, good procurement people. But when we at the break, the Moldovans and the Ukrainians got together, and all they wanted to talk about was how to reduce choice on their IDIQs, on their framework contracts. Like, instead of offering 20 different types of cars, they only wanted to offer 5 in order to reduce choice, because they wanted to reduce their transaction costs. That's all they wanted to talk about, how they could get away with reducing choice. I said, stop. I said, stop. I said, let's all look at our feet. I said, we're all wearing different shoes today. Everybody in this room has different shoes. So if we're all wearing different shoes, we probably have different tastes and different needs. We have to have a diversity of choice for the customers. It's very, very important because you can't presume to anticipate what kind of shoes your customers want to wear. You want to give them that diversity of choice. I said, the fact, and John Luigi was very adroit about this, but the fact that you want to reduce choice harkens back to a time which is really a terrible time for your countries, a communist time. I said, I'm here talking to you in English as an American because those times are gone. We want to have many different kinds of shoes, okay? So a couple points on the U.S. experience as you may have seen yesterday or the day before, the Biden administration announced that they were going to use category management to reduce costs for the federal government by $10 billion. At the federal level, we've all heard this before. It's a political play to say we are saving money by creating by consolidation of demand in a few categories. This happened during the Obama administration. Dan Gordon, very dear friend, former professor at GW, he went into the Obama administration, and he was in charge of category management, the consolidation, in that era, consolidation of office products. And so I sat with him in a forum like this. I said, Dan, by the way, just before you did this, in the 1990s, there was a roll-up of the office products industry. People with capital came in, and they rolled up all these mom-and-pop shops. So an important part of the Obama administration's initiative in this category management is to nurture small businesses. I said, but there are no more small businesses. It's all large businesses, Staples, it's Office Depot, it's the large office product suppliers. And the way it worked out, if you actually go into the contracting structure, what happened in the Obama administration is that the small mom and pop shops who survived were actually ordering from Office Depot. They were using them as a backstop. So this whole thing about category management in a political context becomes distorted. I share the example not to say category management is bad, but bringing politics into this realm adds one more layer of stakeholder that can distort the efficient economics of framework agreements. That's what I want to focus on.
I would say I endorse 98% of all that. And I'll tell you why there is a 2% difference.
You really are a lawyer, you know that? The last quick point is on the transparency. So what John Luigi was referring to in transparency, on this point here, low value contracts, so below a threshold of about $200,000, what we'd call $200,000, those are governed by national regulations in Italy, and it's much more the Wild West, that below that threshold. Above that, European directives cover, below that is the Italian law, and it is a much more crazy procurement world, and Gian Luigi is arguing that his centralized purchasing agency can bring more transparency. That is directly relevant to everybody in this room, because NASPO Value Point, I believe, I'm the rogue here, just so Gian Luigi, I believe that NASPO Value Point can bring transparency to that low-value contracting across state and local governments across the United States. I think this is the solution for bringing transparency to local small value, because NASPO could bring together all those different purchasers in a transparent platform and bring transparency to state and local government in a way that would be transformative. I apologize.
Just one comment before I think we end this segment. The low-value contracts being more visible was a point I just wanted to echo, because I think it'll resonate with the lawyers. I can't get anybody to talk to me on a small transaction on an end-user license agreement. The transaction does not warrant the time and effort involved. If I approach a major consultancy on an IT professional services contract for $200,000 or $300,000, they're not interested in adding the transaction cost, right, lowering their profit margin or increasing our cost for the value of that transaction. But if I have one license agreement with, say, Highland Software, electronic document management vendor, and I enter into that license agreement for all the things we're going to license for them for 5-7 years, and then we put them on a task order contract and have secondary competition on the individual scope of work and the pricing of an individual scope of work, but the lawyers don't have to deal with the terms and conditions or any of the legality issues, then we've substantially enhanced our efficiency, but we've also brought it sufficiently visible, and we've elevated it to the point where we can get their attention and negotiate it. And if I'm putting Deloitte on an IT professional services contract, they will sit down and negotiate, and we've got some bargaining power. We can actually get terms we really want when we use these contract vehicles to do it. The idea is to perhaps take advantage of those benefits and then address some of the cons, which I think when we come back, John Luigi will address in the next slide. John Luigi, any?
Keith, I wanna just complement this by saying that going back to this bargaining power. I mean, we have a European-wide working group on cloud computing, on procurement for cloud services. And it's really to get to give you an idea of how the relevance of bargaining power is that we have Irish colleagues, who are desperate because they cannot get on the other side of the phone, the guys from the big cloud service provider. They don't even answer. They don't want to answer. They don't care. They don't care. They don't care about one public organization. They don't care about the Irish government because they believe that Ireland is too small for them to waste their time. So, I mean, and when you get there, you see that actually the appropriate level of bargaining should not be at any national level, it should be at the continental level, right? So this is something we've been discussing now for a couple of years. It's very hard to get there. But this is to give you an idea. There is a much worse situation that medical supplies or equipment, and in the cloud, you're facing 4 or 5 giants, and they didn't even talk to some countries. Okay, so the idea of setting around the table and getting to similar conditions, I'm not saying it's the magical touch, but it would be one way at least of regaining some bargaining power. And this is something we've been exploring over the past few months with our colleagues in France, in Ireland, and in the UK, trying to get to some European contractual clauses for cloud service. It's very hard. So the bargaining power to me is extremely relevant. At the same time, I agree with Chris. I agree that heterogeneity, diversity of supplies, diversity of solution is important, but let's be clear, it depends on the objective function of each single country in a particular point in time. When we started doing this job more than 20 years ago, we were on the verge of being kicked out of the Euro system because of budget deficits. And we agreed with the Commission that would put really serious hands and serious, emergency recipes to rein our current expenditure. And concept was born out of that. Okay, so contract standardization was a sort of an emergency solution to, we knew, or my colleagues at that, I was not part of that project initially, they knew they were given exactly the same Soviet Union car to every single civil servant or managers and ministries, but by doing so, they were forcing competition to level. The first time we awarded a fixed line telephone contract, and that was awarded to the former monopolist, prices were slashed down by 7% in one competitive tender. So all of a sudden, even our politician realized the profit margin the former state-owned company that had been privatized in that period was able to get in the market. Okay, so, and this is why we've been using, and again, let me mention our experience. We've been using this extreme form of framework. When I say extreme form, means extremely standardized format for natural gas, electricity, fixed lines, cell phone services, fuel, especially in those markets where we knew that in principle their market was populated by very few and large firms. And I get to that point more systematically. I have a couple of slides about the features of demand and supply which we need to look at in order to spot the appropriate solution.
So Gian
What I wanna
Luigi,
mention-
Gian Luigi, just have to butt in. You can't see the room, but you do know that we have different laws here. I need to tell you that Megan Smith is pointing a gun at us right now. if we don't take a break, bad things will happen.
I'm sorry.
Okay, for all the records, I do not have any weapons except my eyeballs.
Well, the metaphorical way.
Yeah, so thank you guys. I want to give you guys a short 10-minute break.
John Luigi, the floor is yours.
We're on the main cons.
Well, right, we're done with the main cons, and let's go now to a little bit the dark side of the force, right? The dark side of the force, the framework agreements, relates. It's very simple because it's sort of the minus sign of the advantages, which is the next slide. I still cannot see it, but it doesn't matter. I mean, you have it.
I didn't change that.
In sorry, no, I don't need that slide, the economy suite, because we've used that already. The only thing I want to mention, which is kind of very intuitive, is that by bundling contract under the same umbrella, that value goes up very simply, and then if you have to select vendors, that might become that value. Higher value might become more or less explicitly a potential barrier to entry for smaller vendors. And then whether you're in the U.S. or in Europe, small vendors reserve a lot of attention, and so we do have ways of getting around this problem, splitting from framework agreements into different lots. I'm not going to have time to enter this particular sub-dimension of framework agreements, but we have to be extremely careful. Now, let me mention this. If there is one lesson that we learned straight away when we started this job, was that the idea of setting nationwide framework agreements was suicidal. I mean, concept almost came to a halt, definite halt because of that. Because my colleagues didn't realize that actually the impact on the supply market would be so dramatic. All of a sudden, many of these, not even, when we talk about small and medium enterprises in Europe, it's not exactly the same order of magnitude that is in the US. Smaller vendors in Europe and in Italy are really small. We're talking about family business, the mom, the dad, the two kids, and maybe the grandfather. That's it. I mean, this 98% of firms are basically this picture, right? So, and this was the sort of unintended consequence of squeezing same conditions, standardization, and getting to very, very quickly to high bargaining power so to save money. At that point, 20 years ago, the only word that was mentioned in this office and in this building where I work was about saving money, all right? It was obsessive, right, but there were serious reasons for being obsessive at that point in time. Over the years, and then I'm going back to Chris' comment, we've learned there is a way of making a better compromise between standardizing, so getting good value for money, but at the same time, providing public bodies with a variety of solutions. Now, what is the optimal degree of variety? No one knows. At the same time, I would be inclined to reject the idea that procuring entities, ministries, agencies, they have to buy whatever they like. I mean, to me, but again, although I've spent many years abroad in Belgium, in UK, in France, I'll still think that what you need depends on what is your mission, right? So let me mention, without making any name explicitly, this conversation with a professor of administrative law in Turin, and she was pretending that the handset we were given with our contracts were the latest model of iPhone was the sort of the penultimate sort of. And I would say, look, you're using that mobile phone as a civil servant. So as a civil servant, your iPhone 10 is by far more than you need to do as a, for carrying out your task as a professor. Don't think of it as a private citizen. As a private citizen, that's a different job. As a professor, you're supposed to do a lot of things, and maybe you don't need exactly the iPhone 15, maybe iPhone 14 or 13 would be enough. Now, who decides that? The centralized procuring organization? I don't think so. I think that we have only to implement guidelines coming from, I would say in our case, from the Treasury. At the same time, I cannot think of complete, I would say, infinite number of degrees of freedom in the hands of civil servants in terms of deciding what they need to buy. I mean, I think that this discussion may go on for days. The only thing I want to mention that we've learned a lot in terms of how to make those tools more flexible, to accommodate for diversity of needs and solutions, and there is a way of doing that by using exactly the same toolbox. Again, so I've basically gone through the potential inconvenience or potential mismatch between demand and supply, the potential barrier to entry for smaller vendors, and then the risk of anti-competitive behavior, which is, to me, I'm an economist, I spend a lot of time talking about what is the meaning of competition in public procurement markets. So to me, this is one of the most urgent, I would say, topics when I talk about framework agreements. Then I don't know, Chris, whether you want to step in right now, because I would like to make an immediate link to the catalogs and to the example we were making about the Amazon.gov case.
John Luigi.
Is it the right time to do so? Yeah.
Before you move on, I wanted to go back to a point that I thought could have been emphasized a bit under the main cons, which is a slide we kind of jumped past. Because one of the things I learned from reading your book that really hit me like a lightning bolt, and I really wanted this group to hear, is this fundamental concept that when the government establishes one of these contracts, it creates a mini marketplace.
Right. You're right, Keith. I was planning to do that in a couple of slides, but
then let's get to it there. Let's get to it there.
If you prefer that, because I have the slide where I put the sort of the connection between framework agreement and the catalogs, there is in fact immediately a reference to this idea of setting. If you don't mind, can I get there? So this is a slide about the link between framework agreements and e-catalogs.
Can we just talk about, because I want to follow up on your slide, Gianluigi. So
yeah, sure.
So Gianluigi, in the previous slide, he talked about transaction cost issues. In the supply chain world, in the public supply chain world, that's not the lawyer world, but in the one lane over, which is the non-law supply chain world dealing with public procurement issues, they identify three key issues. One, that drive organizational dynamics, and therefore drive the rules that we work in. The first one is transaction costs, and Gianluigi has alluded to that already. The next is the principal agent problem. The principal agent problem is that if I ask Keith to go get a cup of coffee for me, he's my agent, and he will almost certainly deviate if he sees something else like a chocolate bar that he wants to get. Okay, that's the principal agent problem. And that is, or it's also referred to as agency theory, and that dates back to the 1970s in the economic literature. It's a pronounced problem in public procurement because we always use an agent. We always use an intermediary. We use a contracting official. We buy cars directly. We don't use an agent to buy cars or computers or houses. We use an agent to identify the house, but we don't use the agent to buy the house for us. In public procurement, we always use an intermediary. We use a contracting official. That creates agency problems because the agent will deviate. The contracting official will deviate. That's what most of you spend your lifetimes working in. It's controlling the agent, making sure that the contracting officer and the contractor follow the optimal outcome. So that's the second issue, which is the agency issue. The third issue that our brothers and sisters in the supply chain world identify is revenue seeking on the part of agencies. that agencies will seek out revenue. And that's a pronounced issue in this area of IDIQ contracting, because the centralized purchasing agencies, their views may be distorted by revenue seeking. So the argument for regulation is actually, the arguments for regulation are actually grounded in organizational theory. You identify the organizational pathologies, and that would trace you back into the rules.
I'm good to let John Luigi continue.
Okay, so no, well, I mean, and one of the pleasures of always having sharing the stage with Chris is that he put so much meat on the table that it's very hard to keep this time under control. So I'll force my discipline, and he's right. He's right. There is. When we introduce a very different agent, which is a centralized procurement agency, the principal agent problem becomes even more interesting or convoluted, because procurement agency may depart from the principal's objectives because there is a revenue issue. How do we make our living if we charge fees on vendors? Which is a proportion of the value of contracts, then there is a potential of there are many risks down there, and we don't have time to go through this because we want to focus on the object. But focusing on the object I would say it's very restrictive because the object cannot be disentangled from the organizations. Using the object. But I'll promise that I won't, depart from that line, that track. And I want to enter that particular point that Keith was mentioning, which I think is very important. And this is why I set up this slide that, to be honest, I never use. I mean, it was talking with Keith and Chris over the summer about this event, that I sort of thought, well, maybe the point of having a marketplace now being used by the federal government for low-value contracts is a way of approaching the problem the other way around. It's like saying, this is an e-catalog or an e-commerce-like platform is nothing more than an unstructured framework agreement. Because in fact, what you have different categories of goods and services, but you don't know how vendors got selected. Maybe they were not even selected. All of them were there, and they are free to sort of advertise their offering. You don't know how procuring entities are running. Maybe they are free to choose whichever solution, whatever solution they may find useful or profitable. And at the same time, you don't know whether, for instance, economic conditions are going to depend on whether they are buying one computer rather than 10 computers rather than 1,000 computers, okay? So all these aspects are nothing more than the strings that we tend to use every single time that we think of a framework agreement. So when we set a meta category of goods and services, so it's a way of defining, and I beg your pardon if I'm misusing some American jargon. I'm defining basically a scope of work. It's a sort of a broad set of activities. When I say activities, it could be supplies, or service. It doesn't really matter. But in doing that, I'm defining the relevant market, the potential market that I'm addressing. So this is the simple fact of defining the basic terms of condition is a way of cutting the universe of our vendors into a smaller universe of those potentially able to respond to this broad set of solutions, even without having any formal competitive process. You're already narrowing down the set of potential vendors with whom you're going to interact. And now, this is only the first part of the story. And so, a framework agreement is nothing more than a way of putting more structure on a standard, e-commerce like catalog, right? It's a way of saying I am determining beforehand what are the terms of the condition of my family of meta category of supplies or services. I am deciding beforehand what are the rules in order to enter that, to pass through the first stage. And I'm going to determine also the rules governing whether if you buy one item rather than a zillion items, you have to pay a different price. So it's adding more structure to this. And so on the one hand, one may say, well, what's the point? I don't care. If I need to buy one computer or take a computer, I don't care. A transaction cost argument that I will be using later would say, well, choose whichever solution gives you, reduces the lead time to a bare minimum. But this is not only our purpose. Our purpose is to strike a balance between compressing transaction costs, but at the same time getting what we need and getting different terms and conditions depending on what I need. If I need 10 computers or a zillion computers, it seems kind of wise to use a mechanism that drives the price down. I'm using that, which is very intuitive, but there are many other circumstances that could be, mentioned, all right? So the family, or what I call the galaxy of framework agreement solutions, is a way of putting structure on something that in the private market is nothing more than a large set of solutions whereby consumers can pick and cherry pick whatever they like. But when it comes to public management, it makes sense to think about that conditions might vary depending on the nature of demand. Okay, I mentioned quantities. I mentioned another dimension could be delivery place, could be timing, could be other conditions that a final user can put in the contract. Keith was and Chris also. I think Chris was mentioning this story. I mean, the only thing that I've learned from my legal friends, from my lawyers and also legal scholars, is that in the European tradition, a contract, and again, I don't want to enter this, but a contract is something which is perfect, which determines all the clauses and conditions of the trade-in between the private party and the public party in that particular exchange. Now, so this is why every single time that you leave some of those clauses open, empty, or could be amended, that by itself does not define a contract. So it requires a further step, more work in order to pin down exactly all the necessary conditions. I think this is important because from an economic viewpoint, the fact that you're not determining all the conditions is equivalent to raising the amount of uncertainty in the transaction. And there is one thing that economic students are taught, regardless of whether they go to Harvard, they go to Caltech, or to London School of Economics, or in my case, Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium, is that an uncertainty is a cost. And so if you leave too much uncertainty in a negotiation, you're gonna pay for that. Uncertainty is sometimes useful because it allows you to kind of profit from many alternatives, but you have to pay for that. So vendors will shift, will make the public sector pay for too much uncertainty. So you have to use uncertainty when it's really needed, not because you haven't thought in advance about the fact that you were leaving too much uncertainty in the transaction. And I don't know whether all these make sense to, especially to a family of lawyers, but this is very intuitive, right? This is why we buy insurance. We buy insurance, we want to transfer the risk for someone who is in a better position to handle that uncertainty, and we pay a premium for transferring the risk of caused by, related to a car accident, you name it. And that happens exactly in a public computer under different forms. Okay, so we're to be aware, then uncertainty has to be used when it's needed, not because we haven't thought about that, right? So, and that leads me to very naturally from kind of describing a framework agreement as a set of conditions, of elementary conditions that, in a very joyful way, I would define sort of a legal approach to framework agreements. And I like that. This is very much an economic way of thinking about framework agreements. Framework agreements are related to a set of transactions that may have similar clauses. Please, can we move to the
Can I just pick up? Can we go back just to that, to the taxonomy? Because your taxonomy
Sure.
is really interesting, just for the American lawyers here. So the taxonomy is going from the simple to the complex. And Keith touched on the services contracting issue before, the professional services contracting. Really, and by the way, for those of you who are interested in potentially authoring in this area, Tara Ward, who's the editor-in-chief of the Public Contract Law Journal, is right here. She's a good person to buttonhole if you're interested in getting involved in the literature side of this. And Tara and I would, as people who work in the federal space, will tell you in professional services is a unique thing. These are commercial contracts under the IDIQs, like the GSA schedules, but in these commercial contracts, what Tara and I will see as practitioners is that services contracts, the services price is not on a fixed price basis. The services price is essentially on a cost reimbursement basis. The contractor has divulged its cost of its employees. It puts an overhead element on top of that, a profit element, and negotiates from that. So it's disclosing, it's a rough form of cost reimbursement contracting. Until Keith was making a discussion this morning about consolidation of demand, and Gian Luigi was, I didn't really understand why do we see that? Because Tara and I have spent a career kind of we kind of ignore that because it's cost reimbursement contracting buried inside what should be a fixed price environment. The answer is the consolidation of demand. That the government has so much consolidated demand in these IDIQ contracts, they can persuade the service contractors to disclose their costs. It's kind of a miracle. It's really extraordinary, but explains why you see this legal anomaly in the marketplace. I just want to touch quickly on what Gian Luigi is talking about, an accommodation, uncertainty, certainty, economy, et cetera, trying to figure out how you're going to mold these contracts. It's very easy to talk about extremes in the American market. You have traditional contracting, you have something like NASPO Value Point, you have Amazon.com at the other end, okay, Amazon.gov. I wrote an article with this with a few colleagues. We went through the Amazon.gov original negotiation history. I am here to tell you, as a lawyer, if you negotiate with Amazon, you will lose. The government always loses going up against Amazon. What Amazon.gov is all about is Amazon will not surrender its standard commercial terms. They want to follow the standard commercial practices. They won't accommodate the government. So, for example, federal employees not supposed to buy Huawei devices because of espionage concerns. They're still on Amazon.com. You can buy them, Huawei devices. So the government will always lose, which means that you want to find a middle point. That's what NASPO Value Point is. It's really relational contracting. There's an ongoing relationship between the CPOs, NASPO Value Point, and the ultimate customers. It's relational contracting, filling that gap in uncertainty. It's a middle point solution in a very, very interesting way. That's enough for me, John. Do you want to go to the next slide?
Okay, so the next one, please.
Mm-hmm.
This is a sort of joyful picture. They're supposed to put a little bit of color in a word which is, very unfortunately considered very sad word of public procurement. I find it so exciting, and every single time, I mean, maybe people get excited because of the Italian accent or something, I don't know, but I still, with a mixture of interferences. Or the next one, please, is about, it's a way of capturing this idea. I want to capture by using the next slide, which is about the BRICS approach to building framework agreements for pursuing three objectives. One, every single time we define a transaction, first of all, the way we define a transaction is an array of conditions comprising technical specifications, contractual, financial clauses, and either clauses related even to, social aspects rather than environmental related aspects. I mean, to an economist, a transaction is nothing more than a vector of conditions. And when you X-ray demand, what you're doing, and so the purpose of gathering information about demand is a way of saying, look, guys, tell me to what extent do you have different numbers in every single cell, or maybe you have similar numbers in each single cell. Now, I'm using here the example borrowed from the IT equipment world, but it could be extended to other markets. So if demand is very heterogeneous, then what happens that it seems plausible that there are very few elements in common. And so the idea of setting a master contract is the idea of setting a master contract, which is an agreement. Let me use agreement, sorry, I'm kind of more at ease with that terminology. It's an agreement, so it's not a contract. It's an agreement in which very few items have been determined. By doing so, you're basically enlarging the scope of work in the relevant market. So it tells you immediately where are what kind of the room for competition for entering that agreement. And so as you start filling in and you realize that basically final users are going to put exactly the same figures in the same cell. So you're basically squeezing all the needs into a framework agreement which sort of comprises most of those dimensions. You can immediately see you're going from towards a world in which you can aim at standardizing as much as you wish. You see, depending on whether you are able to fill the number of cells you can fill in at the first stage, you will determine not only the variety of solution, but also the extent to which there might be competition at the first stage. So presumably, when your demand is very heterogeneous, I will go back to this point by using an additional picture, but I want to use conceptually, because I think it's so intuitive that if you are able to fill in very few cells, then logically you're going to address yourself to a potential large number of firms, provided there is a large number of firms, especially if they are specialized and that provide different solutions. So that gives you immediately an idea that the first stage is not that meaningful in competition-wise. And so if this is not the case, you want to maximize the number of potential solutions to enter the agreement, then you should target the second stage as the most appropriate stage to pin down exactly the needs, and so to force those guys entering the agreement to compete for the actual contract. Okay? This is a very strong statement, I know that.
No, but Gianluigi, but you're dealing with a room full of people who are working in very different state environments, Gianluigi, and the logical next step of what Gianluigi just told you is he's assuming that the customer that uses this contract is smart enough to know how to use it, to be able to tell, for example, between different types of computers. To put a finer point on this, the centralized purchasing agency has an incentive to make this as simple as possible because they're creating a broader marketplace and they're getting more fees. So they want to make this as simple as possible. It assumes that the ultimate customer agency is smart enough to be able to negotiate to protect itself. Let me give you a very stark example. Congress has approved services IDIQs that have no prices in them. Say that again. Services IDIQs that have no prices. Prices will only be negotiated in the second stage. This is a bonanza potentially for the services contractors because they're not getting screened at all. There's no price pressure at the first step. It only comes at the second step. And if they can find a not very smart agency customer, they can make a lot of money. So you have to be very conscious of who the second stage customers are when you make assumptions that the first stage should be as flexible as possible.
Well, this is why you need a centralized procurement organization, right? This would be, I don't think this is your conclusion, but it would be my conclusion. So if you think of, let's take this more seriously. Yeah. Go ahead.
Megan asked me to give an example because there were a few people that weren't quite following. So let me give you an example of what I think I heard Gianluigi say. On one end, in my state, we put out a multiple award task order contract for the application of asphalt emulsions for a mile of roadway. And we know exactly what the cost is. We know exactly what they want them to do. There's a high degree of uniformity. So everything is done at the first stage, and the call-off or the second stage task order doesn't really require competition. It's almost availability, right? We actually have what's called a tier. We call the first person who gave us the best price. If they can't do it, we go to the second person. But we know exactly what the pricing is. It's like a commodity, okay? It's like, well, you ran out of pencils, go to number 2 for pencils. And so everything, all the real competition is done at the first stage. On professional services, where we're headed now on IT professional services, is we're doing the first stage is a very limited competition so that it's not everybody, but we get everybody on the same page on a general set of terms and conditions, but there's no price competition. But the second stage is going to be a fixed price scope of work for a defined set of professional services, so all the competition is at the second stage.
At
and
the
so
second stage.
The beauty of John Luigi's book is this: you see the entire range of possibilities of what happens at the first versus the second stage and how you use task order contracting depending upon the economics of each set of facts.
Keith, if I may, so I think it would be worth jumping to the picture that I put in the classification. Not that, because in a way I've already I've done that just by discussing. It would be no, that's appropriate. The one of main families of framework agreements,
Which
which
one?
sort of
Go back.
which is slide number. No, go forward. The number 17 or 18. This is it. Okay. So the previous one. So the example you were mentioning would be in my matrix here. Now I know may look like a little bit alien to American eyes, but this is in fact very intuitive. So what you were mentioning, Keith, is an example of multi-award complete framework agreement. So you set very precisely the scope of work in the master contract. You select a certain number of vendors. We're not going to enter the discussion about whether you selected 25 rather than a zillion or 150. That for the time being, I mean, we will need 2 days to discuss this. And the next time that I come to and visit you in person, we will discuss this. But what happens is that there are reasons why you want to have competition at first stage. Why you want to have multiple vendors? Because maybe solutions are not necessarily the same. Demand would require, different things. So we use that, for instance, for medical equipment, for ultrasound machines. We know exactly what are the technical specifications. We do know that there are a few guys out there. So we want to have competition at the first stage, but we want to leave hospitals, public hospitals, in a position to choose exactly the machine they want. And this is in healthcare. This is one of the few exceptions in our regulation in which doctors, the general manager of a public hospital, can decide to pick the guy ranked number 3 or 4, because it's basically the physician telling him that it's exactly the right machine. And this is because our law says that ultimately the responsibility of the patient's health is in the hands of the physician. So they have the right to choose the cardiac stents or any other, implantable they need based only on their, I would say, medical knowledge. And that becomes discretion in a public procurement process. But we don't have any second round competition, but there's no point in a second round competition. We know everything from the very beginning. But now, in the sort of northwest box is exactly, there lies the beginning of the histories of many centralized procurement organizations in Europe. So the obsession with savings, and especially, but not even in Italy, mind you, that was actually the genetic code of our twin sister in Austria and in Finland. They started with that particular subfamily that might look like an extreme form of centralization, basically the same contract, only one vendor, only one awardee, and afterwards, there is nothing you can do. The master contract contains all the terms of the condition. The only thing you have to do as a final user is just to click and buy a share of the cake, right? Now, if you go to the UK, that tradition is very much in the tradition of finding the appropriate balance between having some form of competition at the first stage, but also second round competition at the second stage, when contracts become more tailored according to the final user's needs. And this is the sort of southeast box, which is called the multi-award incomplete. Now, something that was put in our regulation, and I have to say I'm really proud of this, because this is something that the European policymaker has added in the in the most recent, which still goes back to 2014, piece of legislation, is what I call the hybrid family. The hybrid family is exactly tailored for the needs of a centralized procurement. And I want to stop here for a minute to tell you that if you're thinking of even of a mild form of centralizing or demand aggregation, this is exactly the family you should look at immediately. Why? Because it's a sort of it's a mixture of two different families, the one on the left and the other on the right side. So it's a way of saying, well, at the very beginning, I can select a certain number of vendors, and then there are some contracts that can be awarded directly without reopen competition. And there are other cases which I can reopen competition among those who have been admitted through the first stage. And the only constraint that our continental regulation puts on this is you have to decide beforehand what is the rationale that you're going to use in order to determine whether you kick and buy from anyone on the list, or you're going to reopen competition. And this seems to me an extremely useful concept. We've been discussing this with the Commission for years, and I was really surprised when I read that particular paragraph in the regulation, because this was actually a kind of indirect lobbying by a centralized procurement organization. We really needed a kind of compromise between two extreme forms. And in fact, this is very, very often used. We've used that let me give an example. We use that for an extremely valuable, and I would say, high value framework agreement for public lighting. So it's a framework agreement for maintenance and for new investment for public lighting services at the municipal level. And so what happens is that we are using the fixed condition part of the framework agreement for all the municipalities whose infrastructure is very limited, it's not complex, okay? And this is captured by the number of lampposts in a particular town, okay? Below a certain threshold, there is absolutely no need for reopening competition. But then if the city of Milan or Rome are going to use that particular framework agreement, they are likely to have a more sophisticated infrastructure. So they need to have a tailored project. So they need to talk to vendors in order to have a fairly different project. So they need to reopen competition at the second stage. So you see that there is a potential for making it a very nice compromise between, the transaction cost argument. I want to quick and dirty because I want to go fast, and I can pick the third one, the fourth one, rather than there is a room for an additional state of competition, because I can gain from having more competition because I can get a more tailored suit or contract, but at the same time I can provide an incentive vendors to offer better value for money, or at least modify the value for money depending on my specific needs. You see, and this is captured, is a way of saying there is more. And the more you think of it, the more you can explore other varieties or hybrid solutions starting from this picture. That is admittedly very stylized, I know that, but it seems to me kind of good starting point to make an idea of what kind of subfamilies I'm looking for.
Can I just throw in a couple of things here for the U.S. experience, John Luigi, if that's okay? First of all, we got a question from the audience as to whether or not there's any case law talking about things like multiple awards. The answer is yeah, there's over 20 years of case law in the federal government now. If you wanted to look at that case law, it's under FAR 16, subpart 16.5 or FAR subpart 8.4. That's the Westlaw search. You can look at those, look at the cases that evolved under those subparts. This issue of multiple awards has been litigated extensively. Most recently, it was litigated in the context of the JEDI contract, the cloud contract, where the DoD wanted to make a sole award, and ultimately the decision was made to make multiple awards. I want to, this is a really important issue for NASPO Value Point on this issue of multiple awards. So NASPO Value Point has 30 OEMs, 30 contractors on the IT equipment contract, and the problem is the analyses, including the analyses by lawyers, tend to be inside out. 30 vendors as opposed to the hundreds or thousands of vendors on the GSA schedule. Why are there only 30? Well, NASPO has decided that 30 vendors gives it enough of a scope across the IT marketplace. That's an inside-out analysis. What the hard part as lawyers is you have to jump in the marketplace and make an outside in. The reality is if you have too few vendors, those vendors can lock out new suppliers who during the course of this IDIQ or this framework agreement, this NASPO Value Point contract, new people have new technologies that they want to bring into this marketplace, this limited defined marketplace. If there are too few vendors, if there are too few primes, they charge too much in terms of, they charge the new technology provider too high a fee to be a subcontractor. They're taking too much profit, and the vendor will just steer away from the marketplace because they don't want to pay a huge chunk of their margin to the prime contractor just to get into this limited marketplace. So you, as a lawyer, when you're thinking about issues like how many vendors should there be, it's not just an inside out, it has to be an outside in analysis as well.
Outside in.
And just so to kind of put what Gian Luigi just been putting in context, why are we discussing Italian economic principles? And the answer is we can accelerate our work as lawyers if we understand the hydraulics of the system, if we understand the basic economic principles, the organizational issues that are the same in Italy as here. We accelerate on our understanding as lawyers. We don't get locked in formalism. That's why this is so important.
Let me echo that with just a slight variation of saying it. When I started in what I'm doing now, my starting point was the statute and was the law. And oftentimes my client's mindset was, just tell me if it's legal. This is a completely different mindset. This is the mindset of the economist. What is going to work? What is going to create efficiency and a positive economic outcome for everybody involved while maintaining the principles of procurement that are important, like transparency and accountability? And so when you start it from Gian Luigi's standpoint, you're not saying, well, what does my statute say exactly? What you're looking at is, well, wait a minute. If I do it this way, it works for multiple award that's incomplete or complete or a hybrid, and that creates the most efficient outcome for everybody while maintaining the principles. And the challenge for the lawyers is, how do we make that work under our laws, or how do we change the laws to make it work, but don't change them such that it's so flexible that we can do anything, and then the client comes in and says, well, we can do whatever we want to, and who cares about the economics of it, which is often what I find. And so my starting point has become the framework that Gian Luigi is setting up so that I'm looking for the economics of it before I ever start with the statute.
Well, this is amazing that coming from you guys in the States, I mean, to Italy, it sounds like the most counterintuitive discussion I ever heard in my life. So this is why to be not to keep up with promises. Should we jump to the slides, the nature of competition, because that summarizes. I mean, this is still the picture that I use with my colleagues after I don't know how many years, and every single time we sit down and we talk about a problem, I use this picture. And then I can add multiple layers of complexity or interferences coming from, temporarily, objective functions or are, they have to take into account the vagaries of, I would say, higher spheres interferences. Doesn't matter. The starting point is whether or not final users are strategic or non-strategic. If they express that their needs are very different, this is what I put on the vertical axis. It's the main feature of demand. So there's a economic way of saying they are different. We call it demand heterogeneity. When heterogeneity is very high, and we are in a market in which there are potentially, 150 vendors. So this picture says that you have to go towards the northeast. So the appropriate way of approaching the market is to get aboard enough vendors, and I'm not saying what enough means. It's again, we will need more time to talk about that. So we need multiple award, and then we will need to release kind of suit competition or not. There is too much uncertainty at the first stage, so we cannot push for too much competition at the first stage. We need to move or shift competition towards the second stage. So this is why the light green approach of framework agreement, multiple award with reopening competition seems to be the most appropriate solution. Now, which particular form? It depends on many things. Depends on the market, many circumstances. But you get immediately an idea if you have a specialized market, if fragmentation, if you have heterogeneity of demand, there is no way you're going to squeeze all there is no way you're going to fill all the cells at the very beginning. You need to wait and see what the final users express in terms of needs. And so in order to guarantee or to raise the likelihood you get very good outcome, a good matching, so you get the best fit vendor for your need, and you get exactly the best possible conditions, both technical and economic, you need to look for the second stage to get that, not at the first stage. At the first stage, there's too much uncertainty. So the only thing you need is to set the rules of the game and to, get aboard the most able guys in the market, okay? So this is why, if you look at DG Cloud in the UK, so their framework agreement for cloud services, at the first stage, it's nothing more than sort of almost, it's not exactly, but almost a list of vendors. It's not really, there is not really a selection at the very first stage. The competitive part is postponed until the second stage. But I want to mention this point. I'm mentioning this as if it were a very, simple thing. But mind you, the most visible part of a framework agreement is always the first stage. When it comes to the second stage, that second stage is by far less transparent than the first stage. This is why, from an antitrust point of view, the second stage becomes more relevant. If there are multiple awards, there are a flow of contracts, and you're selecting too few vendors, you're creating exactly the perfect scene for a crime, whereby you have 3 vendors competing or pretending to compete for a very long flow of contracts. And, willy-nilly, that second stage is less transparent than the first stage. So from a competitive viewpoint, you have to be extremely careful on what you do there, because that's going to determine what really happens and the trade, the quality of the trade that each single procuring entity is going to strike with an awardee. But going back to our initial experience,
Gian, Luigi, I have to interrupt here. I just, because I hearkened to this point earlier, this is what hit me like a lightning bolt when I read his book, his and Caroline's book. The way we define the scope of work defines how many vendors can actually bid at a secondary competition. And the number of vendors we put on that contract can create the perfect petri dish for fraud, corruption, bid collusion, fixed pricing, all the evils that we are here to prevent. And it would never dawn on me after 25 years of practice that we may be the problem in the way we structure our contracts, our indefinite delivery contracts. We're actually creating the very problem we were here to avoid. And I just wanted to take the point he made and really just slap it in your face, because it really is a big deal. We need to be careful when we structure these things that we're not creating the problem.
Putting Keith's point into legal terms, there are 4 things that you have to address in contract formation. It's price, quality, contractor qualification, that would be responsibility, and the final is terms and conditions. Those are the four things in a public contract. What Gianluigi has told you is that there may be a situation where you really only make a qualification assessment. Is this contractor fundamentally qualified? Remember, he referred to a list of all the vendors in the industry. Is this contractor fundamentally qualified, and what are the terms and conditions? No Huawei, for example. What are the terms and conditions that will be imposed? In terms of quality and price, there are scenarios that he's talking about. There are scenarios where those quality and price issues will all be deferred to the second stage, to the task or delivery order stage.
Thank you for letting me interrupt,
And
John.
so, no, that's good. All I'm saying is that as an economist, I want to take for granted the degree of heterogeneity. And again, let me stress this, that I don't care the source of heterogeneity. Strategic, fruitful revelation, I don't care. That's not my job, okay? It's not my job to assess to the extent to which my final users are truthful in revealing their preferences. The only thing that matters, my logic, is once I get that picture, and get that picture is not easy at all. It involves a lot of investment. I want to make sure that I create conditions for healthy competitions at the second stage. And this is important because this second stage has been immensely overlooked by antitrust authorities national antitrust authorities in Europe. I mean, it's thanks to public procurement experts that now antitrust authorities are putting their nose more deeply into what happens at the second stage. I'm not pretending I play any role in that. All I'm saying is when I talk to my friends, I mean, turns out that for instance, the chief economist at the Italian antitrust authorities is a former student of mine that when I was in London, he was one of my first students. And we spent a lot of time, and he says, look, we are, when they talk to other colleagues around Europe mentioning this fact, they open their mouth by saying, oh, we didn't know. How do we do that? So the more you transfer towards the second stage, the more you have to be attentive, the more you have to gather in terms of information about the terms of condition determined at the second stage, at the call-off stage of a framework agreement. Conversely, if you are in a situation that Italy experienced 20 years ago, whereby we had to squeeze all terms and condition at the first stage, I think it's going to be, no, I mean, this is okay. This picture is okay. You set all the conditions, then especially if you select only one supplier or even a few suppliers, the competition for the framework agreement is what matters. The first round is going to be the most important. Why? Because at the second stage, nothing happens, right? So there's nothing. You cannot amend anything, right? So there is no point in looking afterwards. You have to look at the first stage. And this is for transparency and for the regulatory nature of framework agreement. This is normally the point in time that everybody looks at. But it is okay if you're using a single award framework agreement with all fixed conditions. That's okay. But if you're using the other extreme, you have to look to both stages, competition for the framework agreement and in the framework agreement. I'm using the terminology that antitrust people would be using. So sometimes competition for framework agreement is all that matters. Some other times it doesn't matter at all. I mean, it's completely irrelevant. And so if you look at that, if you look at a list of vendors, there is no point of collusion. There is no collusion whatsoever happening just because there is absolutely no contract. The terms are not fixed. So put yourself into the shoes of a cartel. How are you going to determine how to share the pie if you don't know the pie precisely? If you don't know whether there is a cream or chocolate or cheese on top of it, you don't know, right? So you have to know how the cake is made before striking an agreement, which is unlawful. I mean, it's actually criminal activity in the US. So this is why it's important to think about the uncertainty when things get fixed, when clauses become, all the cells are filled in, because it's at exactly that point in time that you need to have a sort of a closer look in terms of competition. I've sort of summarize this. I mean, yes, Chris, please.
We only have a few seconds left, so I'll make my closing comments, because Gian Luigi has basically presented you really important legal and policy decisions for this community, for the NASPO community. What he's told you is that the most interesting things happening in the economy are what he calls in the northeast corner, where there's a great deal of heterogeneity of demand, where there's novel solutions coming into the marketplace. So you know that the most interesting things, the most important things that your states buy are going to be ones where the second stage competitions become really important. He's also told you that as a natural function of this marketplace, there's not going to be enough transparency. There could well be not enough transparency, enough competition. The solution in NASPO Value Point is to address that through the supplemental addenda. That the supplemental addenda can call for adequate competition and adequate transparency at that second stage. You're basically trusting your state agencies to be aggressive in drafting supplemental addenda. You know in reality that doesn't happen. Oftentimes the vendors control that second stage, the supplemental addenda. So there isn't adequate transparency, there isn't adequate competition at the second stage. That means the question shifts back to NASPO. How does NASPO structure these overall vehicles so that in that second stage you have adequate competition and adequate transparency, because Gian Luigi has told you that that's the most important place in your public procurement marketplaces. That's the most interesting stuff. It's going to make the biggest difference for the citizens of your states.
I think all I'll say is my focus is at the state cooperative, the state term contract level, where we deal with these issues. What I really wanted out of all of this was for, I think many of you look at your in-state cooperatives, your term contracts, right? Your indefinite delivery term contracts at the state level. And you go, there's some disconnect between all the stuff and all these rules and all these policies that underline, we bid everything one at a time, and the way we structure these things. And what I wanted you to be aware of was there's actually a lot of conversation about this. There's a lot of conversation in the law journals, there's a lot of conversation on the economic side, and if you have an interest in doing something a little different in your state that can provide a better outcome or avoid some of the problems, you're now aware of some of the resources and some of the framework for thinking about it. And I think Gian Luigi has done a great job of kind of introducing that to you, and I hope you will run with it. Gian Luigi, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. I mean, thank you first of all, for inviting me, although, unfortunately I couldn't join you in person, and for being patient and to listen to, it's not necessarily, I never take it for granted that, all audiences will be interested in this approach. So thank you very much. It's been really an honor personally, and looking forward for further opportunities to that. Keith, thank you. Chris and the organization, Megan, Mary, and all the people in NASPO community. Thank you very much.